Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today in our Infosec seminar organized by the Information System Security and Assurance Management Department in Mahalshan School of Management. We begin our June Infosec seminar by acknowledging that although this seminar is being held virtually, Concordia University of Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground and home for many indigenous peoples, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and the Nakota Sioux peoples. We respect and acknowledge this. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Tim Lohrmann, the President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Barbara Van Engen, the Vice President, Academic and Provost, Dr. Alison Yakshan, Dean of Management, Dr. Patrick Kamau, Dean of Graduate Studies, Dr. Andreas Gluzu, the Deputy Provost, who joined us today for this great Infosec seminar. Today, we are pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Tim Raines, to give us an interesting talk about government access to data examined. Tim Raines is an internationally recognized cybersecurity executive, advisor, and author. Currently, Tim is Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at ADT, the largest security and automation company in the United States, protecting 6.5 million households. In this role, Tim leads enterprise, cybersecurity, and product security. Previously, Tim was Vice President of Trust and Cyber Risk at T-Mobile, where he led cybersecurity strategy, architecture, assurance, risk management, compliance, and the Business Information Security Officer function. T-Mobile has the largest 5G network in the world. Prior to T-Mobile, Tim held cybersecurity leadership positions at both Amazon Web Services, AWS, and Microsoft. At AWS, Tim was the global security and compliance leader for worldwide public sector, where he spent 3 years living in London, England, helping to start AWS's worldwide public sector business in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. In the 17 years Tim spent at Microsoft, he held numerous roles, including Global Chief Security Advisor, Director of Security, Identity, and Enterprise Mobility, Director of Trustworthy Computing, and founding technical lead of Microsoft's customer-facing cybersecurity incident response team. Tim is the author of the popular book, Cybersecurity Threats, Malware Trends, and Strategies, published by Packet Publishing. Thanks, Tim, so much for being with us today, sharing your experience with our audience. Just 2 quick notes. During the presentation, microphones will be turned off to avoid interrupting the speaker. At the end, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and microphones will be turned back on. Please limit yourself to 1 question to give opportunity to other participants to ask. If we have enough time, please feel free to re-ask again. Please be sure to provide us with your name and email address in the linked form so we may send you your certificate of attendance. Thank you. It's all yours now, Tim.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks for suffering through all that. I didn't realize you were going to read that entire background, but thank you very much. I'll share my screen here, and I've got a deck prepared that we can go through. It's an honor for me to talk with such an esteemed audience. Thanks for making time in your busy days to come to this. This is one of my favorite topics. I was talking with some of the folks here on the call before it started about like what sort of interests me and some of the other folks. And so I went to University of Alberta, did a degree in political science. And prior to that, I was at Concordia College before it became a university studying business. And that experience, doing the political science stuff, I was always interested in political science. And I've never really been uninterested in it. It just actually kind of increases as time goes on. And I think that's what keeps me in cybersecurity, is this intersection between technology, cybersecurity, national security, public safety. There's just this very, very interesting intersection. And so today, that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end. You guys have already suffered through my resume. I won't talk much about it. Prior to moving down to the United States in the late 90s, I was born and raised in Edmonton. spent a little bit of time in Calgary teaching at the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. And I worked, prior to that, I worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Edmonton as an informatics support guy. I worked at the Department of Justice, Alberta Department of Justice. So in the Brownlee building in downtown Edmonton. That's where I met my wife. Anyway, it's a pleasure to talk with you guys. As you heard my intro, I've written some books. The second edition, I actually had the courage to publish these 2 chapters on the roles of government in cybersecurity. And this topic, we're going to talk about government access to data. Prior to this, in the first edition, I didn't publish these chapters. At the time, I was working for a big tech company, and it would just seem too risque, actually, as a security advisor at a big tech company, to talk about government access to data. And I'll talk a little bit about my background here and my experience with this topic. But I published it in this particular edition, and these are my favorite chapters in the book. And you can see they're the least technical chapters, but it took me, chapter 7 in particular probably took me 3 or 4 months to write. And I'll show you, there's a lot of research that went into this topic. We'll kind of scratch the surface here, but if you're interested in kind of a deeper dive and so on, I've spent a bunch of time on these 2 chapters. And so this idea, this whole concept of government access to data really kind of became a thing. It always has been a thing, but I think it really became a hot topic back in 2013 when Edward Snowden did the disclosures on the NSA programs that up until that point were secret. And so, he disclosed a whole bunch of information when he was in Hong Kong, and then obviously he fled to Russia, and he's been living there ever since. But there was that kind of kicked it off for me professionally. I worked at Microsoft at the time in Redmond, and suddenly, instead of doing threat intel briefings, I would do 1,000 threat intel briefings a year. People were asking me about this topic of government access to data, and every big customer was interested in it. Anybody, any international organization or multinational organization, suddenly they wanted to talk to me about government access to data. I was the primary spokesperson for cybersecurity at Microsoft at that time. So lots of people wanted to talk to me about this topic, and it didn't stop. Later in my career, when I worked for Amazon Web Services based in London, that's all they wanted to talk about in Europe. They would not even really talk about cybersecurity. They wouldn't talk about the cloud. They wanted to talk about government access to data, and specifically U.S. government access to data. And I'll explain why that topic is so interesting versus other countries and their government's access to data. So as we go through this, I'll kind of touch on these different aspects that you see here on the slide. Just a recap of kind of what I see the government, different governments, what their role really is in cybersecurity, because I think this often conflates things for people. If they don't kind of parse what governments do and how they do it, it can be tempting to look at governments as monolithic, and their approach to cybersecurity is one-dimensional, and it's not. Then we'll dive right into government access to data, what it is, what the data tells us was really going on here. And then, the most interesting part of this is the insights in the European perspective. So I lived there for 3 years with my family, and I traveled around Europe, Middle East, Africa, 5-6 days a week. And so as a security advisor at Amazon Web Services, all they wanted to talk about is this topic. And so I learned a lot from people in Germany, Brussels, Stockholm, the list goes on. So I'll give you some insights, which I think is probably, for me, the most interesting part of the presentation and sort of the epiphany for me, the aha moment. It might be obvious to you already, but for me, it was an epiphany. Once I understood what the European perspective was, it was really helpful, and it kind of helps me in my role as a cybersecurity executive, particularly with topics like privacy. And then if we have time, we can talk about protecting data from unauthorized access. This is all about encryption and key management, and probably the least interesting part of the presentation, but the most technical. All right, so I would, in my job at Amazon, I would go, to many events, many conferences and summits and so on cybersecurity in all sorts of different countries. And this question, I got interested in, finding out, like, what are people actually worried about in their specific countries? I remember being on stage at a big event in Stockholm, Sweden. There was probably 2,000 people in the audience at this event, and I popped this up on the screen and asked this question. And it was easy to tell what the answer was. And then I started doing this in every event I spoke at in Western Europe and the Middle East. And it's interesting. So I'm interested, obviously, in the Canadian perspective. When I moved back to Seattle, I was still with Amazon, moved back from London. And one of the teams I supported was the Canada team. And so I got to start working with people up in Canada again, as well as the rest of the Americas. And the Canadian perspective is interesting because from what I've seen, it kind of trails the European perspective. 2 or 3 years after they're doing it and talking about it in Europe, suddenly in Canada, it becomes a hot topic, which I don't think is surprising. So anyway, have a read, kind of keep in mind, what is your answer to this question? I can tell you from my experience in Western Europe specifically, 80 to 90% of the people chose C here. They were more worried about U.S. government access to data using a valid search warrant or a subpoena than they were with so-called advanced persistent threat from China or Russia. And I think, based on, the folks I know over there to this day, I've got a lot of good friends and former coworkers. I think this hasn't changed at all there from what I can tell. And they're out talking to customers constantly. And so I don't think they would answer this question any differently today than they did, 5 years ago when I initially asked it there. So this might not be surprising. Like in the United States, when I show people this data, it's like, why do they think that? Outside of the United States, less so, right? When I talk to people in Sweden or Germany, they're like, absolutely, I'm surprised it's so low. And so this is a very, very interesting finding for a lot of people, especially inside the United States, that don't get the chance to talk to Europeans about these topics very often. So let's just quickly talk about, the role of governments in cybersecurity. Because one of the things I've encountered in Canada and other countries is, there's always a view like the government should do this, the government should do that. And they talk about the government as if it's a monolith and it has like a very small set of interests and the entire government works in concert to succeed in these things, right? And that's true at some level. And I think that level really is the very top level, right? And so what I did here is I pulled out a quote from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, since I'm talking to Canadians, about sort of like what sort of epitomizes this, right? So this concept of shared values that support what Pierre Trudeau calls here freedom and immeasurable joy, right? Every country that I sort of looked at has these types of ingredients inside of their Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or in the case of the United States, in the Declaration of Independence, where the famous line, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can go and look at most Western democracies and see these types of ingredients and this type of language being used as sort of one of the reasons, or maybe the primary reason, for the foundation of the government and the laws and the way they're structured. And so when we talk about cybersecurity, it's sort of no different, right? Like the high level, the government, the purpose of the government is to support this so-called pursuit of happiness, right? And they don't do that as a monolith. They're actually organized into different departments or ministries, agencies, depending on what country that you're in. And those things have different charters. Some of those charters are aligned, but some of them are quite different. Some of them are actually opposed to each other. So for instance, you can see here that governments are enforcers. So from a cybersecurity perspective, that typically manifests itself as regulators, and I have to deal with those as a CISO all the time, unfortunately. There's also law enforcement that are trying to enforce the laws of the municipality, state, province, federal laws, and so on. And then there's, for instance, market participants. Governments are major market participants when it comes to cybersecurity because of the level of threats, because they have so much money and usually an outsized ability to influence markets. They get to set the standards in many cases. Some industries rely on them to set standards, so to reduce cost and complexity for their customers and so on. And that's no different. NIST is a standard-setting body in cybersecurity that everybody looks to. NIST 800-53 is sort of the gold standard in cybersecurity that if you're doing business with the federal government of the United States, you need to be aware of and adopting that at some level. Then there's this concept of defenders, right? So obviously governments are part of what governments do is to defend their citizenry. Then there's different ways they do that. So I mentioned earlier that there can be conflicts or there can be different charters that are opposite from each other. So for instance, a public safety organization might be trying to drive down the number of vulnerabilities and the severity of those vulnerabilities in software that their industries are developing. And so they're driving best practices and adoption of those best practices into the industry and asking the industry to adopt those so that they have better quality software, less vulnerabilities that can be attacked and so on. I actually sat on a presidential board here in 2023, 2024 for President Biden and helped write a report on how to incentivize the adoption of best practices, of cybersecurity best practices, and how to measure their adoption here in the United States. The president got that report just a few weeks ago, and we published it up on the CISO site, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So that's an example of like trying to drive an agenda through public safety. But on the other side, you've got national security. And what they're doing is they're actually participating in markets for vulnerabilities. So they're doing primary research, trying to find vulnerabilities, and they're buying vulnerabilities from vulnerability marketplaces, and they're stockpiling these things because they're weapons. And so they're kind of doing the opposite of what the public safety people are asking for. And they're not reporting the vulnerabilities that they're finding or buying to the manufacturers in many cases because they're stockpiling these as weapons so that they can use them against unpatched systems, that their adversaries run. So this is an example of the government doing, they're all aligned with pursuing this idea of happiness, but they're doing it in different ways, right? And that's important to note. And so today, what I'm going to talk about is sort of these two areas in particular, national security and law enforcement. Because in cybersecurity, this, especially in Western Europe, this is what they're concerned with, right? They're concerned that in the United States specifically, that some of the laws and the way that they actually go gaining access to data in pursuit of law enforcement actions or national security, that they've actually weaponized the laws here in the United States. And so this is where the tension starts. And so when we talk about national security and law enforcement in this context, there's kind of three scenarios I try to parse out for people, because if you don't do this, and I talk to 1,000 CISOs about this, they lump them all together and it gets very difficult to understand what the risks actually are. Like, what are the real threats? And then once you understand the threats, you remember risk is probability and impact. Like, what is the real risk of these things? And what can I, as a CISO of an enterprise, do to mitigate these types of risks? So that's really important to understand, because some of them you can mitigate them, but you're not going to have the kind of data and the kind of assurances and the kind of certainty that you have with other risks and threats that you can actually see. So for instance, signals intelligence, you're probably aware, most governments around the world, major governments around the world, have the ability to do signals intelligence, which is intercept signals that are being sent by technology and then use modern encryption methods, cryptanalysis, to decrypt them and look at what the content actually is, right? And this is where this whole notion of, post-quantum encryption comes from, and making sure that, what's secret today can stay secret for the next 60 years or so. There's lots of government secrets that need to be kept for extended periods of time. Right now, one of the debates inside the industry, are the Chinese really collecting all this data? Even though it's encrypted, hey, 15, 20 years from now, they might be able to decrypt it and get access to it. Does it still have the same value, right? So signals intelligence is a hard one, because it's secret. We don't have a whole bunch of data that helps us understand what is happening with signals intelligence. Who's collecting the data? What are they doing with it? How successful are they at decrypting encrypted data? We just don't know. It's secret. Our best defense against this type of threat is encryption, but we don't really know what their capabilities are to decrypt encrypted data. So you're kind of left wondering, right? And you can see the FBI has been asking for a long time for essentially a master decryption key that they can use in investigations, because strong encryption enables threat actors to keep their information private as well, right? So you can see that conversation has been happening for 10 plus years in the United States, where law enforcement, particularly the FBI, have been very vocal about their desire to have a way to get access to data that's being protected by strong encryption. So then there's sort of this, what I call unlawful scenario, which is the James Bond scenario, right? Where governments, steal information, right? And we know they do this because every once in a while you'll get a glimpse that they are doing this. Again, very difficult to understand because there's no reports, there's no data coming to us, like how many people do this, where are they doing it, what are the results, right? You just don't have any insight, right? But this is why we'll talk a little bit later about data residency, why data residency is not really a security control. Because if you have a government and the government wants access to data and they can't get it through signals intelligence or lawful means, they can steal it. And we're talking about people that have the ability to print money, right? So they're governments, right? So they have a lot of power and a lot of capability. So again, we don't have that much visibility into unlawful scenario. But again, the best controls usually are encryption and effective key management, right? So instead of having to protect all your data everywhere it is forever, you encrypt it and then you just have to protect the keys, which is a much easier proposition because of the relative size of these two types of information. And then where I want to focus today is lawful, because lawful government access to data is where we do have a lot of information. And I'll walk you through the data to show you this. And so because we have so much information on lawful government access to data, then we can understand this threat better. We can see what the volume is. And if we can see what the volume is, then we can calculate, like, what is the probability of this impacting me as a CISO of an enterprise? And then what is the impact? What are the probability? What is the impact if this does happen? And so if I can get insight into that, then I can sort of stack rank this risk with all the other risks that my company and other companies have to deal with, right? So you've got economic risks, HR risks, legal risks, and so on. Cybersecurity risks are just another type of risk. And so, what you need to do, though, is look at what your highest priority risks are and then invest in them. And then at some point you run out of resources. So you have to know, like, what risks are you just saddled with, like, that you're going to have to accept, right? So when I talk to people in Europe about this, they maintain that U.S. government access to data is their number one threat. And if there's any risk of that at all, any probability, they're not going to use the service. And so this is where the tension with US-based cloud service providers come from, because they are US-based, many folks in Western Europe simply won't use them and say, we won't use US-based cloud service providers because that makes it easier for the US government to get access to our data. It's not quite true. So let's dig into it a little bit. So for many, many years, the US government has used what are called MLATs, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties, to get access to data that's being held overseas. And I use data kind of loosely because these things are, predate the internet, at least the public internet. Many of them, as you'll see, the one with Canada certainly does. But here's the cover page of the MLAT for the European Union, which you can see was published in 2006. So what these do is they sort of outline how to get access to data, the process that law enforcement uses to get access to evidence that's being held overseas inside a country that has signed an MLAT with the United States. This is how we get access to that evidence. This is the process. This is the scope. This is the limitations. And so you can see here, most of these have a letter of transmittal that's been signed by the president that was in office at that time. And most of them sort of outline, what the scope of the treaty actually entails. And then the rest of the document sort of supports that. So here's the one for Canada. And you can see they outline exactly, what type of cooperation and assistance is required by the treaty. So you can see things like examining objects and sites, exchanging information and objects, locating or identifying persons, serving documents, taking the evidence of persons, and so on. So this is, the way that governments have for many, many years tried to pursue criminals, or at least criminal investigations overseas, because we know for centuries people have tried to flee, jurisdictions, use borders to slow down or stop the legal process, right? And so these MLATs were designed to help alleviate that and get law enforcement access to data, or at least access to evidence. Here, I would normally show this to like the German audiences or the Swedish audiences or the French audiences that push back really hard on U.S. government access to data, and say, did you know that your government signed a treaty with the U.S. government actually giving them access to data? So this isn't the U.S. government coming in and like stealing this. In many cases, your own government, your own law enforcement is going and getting the information they need because they're using the MLAT process to request it. And so they'll see, for instance, here, the one with Germany was published in 2004, and the one here with France was published in 2000. There's about, last time I looked, there were about 69, 70 of these MLATs that were out there. Now, the problem with the MLAT process is, according to Richard Clark, who used to be an advisor at the White House, he came out and said that the average time, to do an MLAT, to get an MLAT serviced, is about 10 months. So if you imagine you're doing an investigation on a crime that happened in Canada, the email that helps you prosecute the perpetrator of the crime is on a server in Cupertino, California, and it takes 10 months to find out, like, does this guy even have an account out there? Can we get access to this picture that we think is inside his email box, right? You have to have very specific, very, very specific requests. And then you wait 10 months to find out, right? So I've talked to police, law enforcement that use this process, and it just drives them crazy because it stretches the investigations of potentially years just processing these MLAT requests, because they go through different layers of the government on both sides of the request and finally get down to the law enforcement that need to take action. So what happened? Well, when I moved to Europe, one of the things that happened, not because I moved, but when I was there, was this thing called the Cloud Act. And for a guy that worked at like the preeminent cloud computing company, hyperscale cloud computing company in the world in Western Europe, and was their cybersecurity leader, this was really bad timing on my part. And the name was really poorly chosen, right? This acronym Cloud Act is terrible, right? So immediately everybody in Western Europe thought, oh, so this is all about cloud providers then. And reality is it applies to any kind of computing service, really, email providers, people that have web pages. And so what they're trying to do here with the Cloud Act is streamline this request process for evidence in criminal matters. So instead of waiting 10 months, what happens is the Cloud Act, they set up these reciprocal agreements, again, with countries, different countries. So the UK has one, Australia has one. I can't remember if Canada signed one of these reciprocal agreements already or not. But essentially, this is to streamline this whole evidence collection across overseas. So instead of responses in 10 months, you'll get responses in days versus months. And it still has like the validity of the court process that you have, where you have to get a court order. The problem here is, number one, the name. That created nothing but problems for cloud providers. It actually enabled, all of the incumbent technology providers in these countries, including Canada, the ability to use FUD to sell against Microsoft and Amazon and Google and others, where they would say, look, this Cloud Act, this applies to Amazon and Microsoft, but it doesn't apply to our company here, our little company in Canada that's been doing business with the federal government for 30 years. It doesn't apply to us. And that's not true, right? In most cases, if you have even $1 of revenue from a US-based customer, or if you have US-based people visiting your web page on your website, that little contact can be enough to bring your company into jurisdiction for the Cloud Act. So this was really tough. I feel like I spent years of my life educating people on what the Cloud Act is, what it isn't. Many of the folks in Europe thought this was Patriot Act 2.0, which is terrible. They revile the Patriot Act, right? It was reviled in most countries outside of the United States and seen as a bit of an overreach. And so it was just years of education trying to get people to understand that this has nothing to do, like this applies to cloud certainly, but it also applies to all the other technology providers that you're using. Okay, and so when I said the reason why this is interesting is because we have lots of data to use to understand what the probability of getting a court order in our supply chain. So what I mean by that is, hey, I'm using one of the vendors that you see here on the screen. I don't receive the warrant or the subpoena myself, so I can't use my general counsel and my legal process to process it. I might not even know that one of my cloud providers or technology providers in my supply chain got a subpoena from the federal government or from another government outside of the United States. And therefore, I don't even know what the probability is. I don't know what the impact will be. I'm blind to this, and that doesn't sit well with any general counsel or CISO or CEO that I've ever talked to, right? They want to use their own legal process to process these things, but they need visibility to do that. So I actually helped develop two of the reports here. I worked on the Microsoft one and the Amazon one at both companies, and got really intimately familiar with them because I was walking customers through them and using these all the time so that they could understand the volume of requests coming to these companies, not only from the US government, but from other governments like the Canadian government as an example. And so this is the volume. The way to read this chart is 2H18 is the second half of 2018, 1H19 the first half of 2019, and so on all the way to the second half of 2022. The reason it ends in 2022, there's a few of these companies that reported some things into 2023, but they didn't all report. So maybe less than half of them probably had numbers reported for 2023. So I wanted to make it fair and show you kind of what the volume looks like apples to apples here. And so you can see, number one, the volumes increase every year. And that's because more and more people are going online, more and more people are using these services from these companies. And law enforcement has realized that there's evidence in there for criminal matters. And so attackers, criminals are following everybody as they go online. So you imagine in your Facebook account, there's a picture. That picture might be helpful in the investigation of a crime. There's email, there's files being uploaded. There's all sorts of things going on here. So these numbers are taken from the transparency reports and law enforcement request reports that I showed you on the previous page. I'm providing you with the URLs here so you can go and look at the numbers, the raw numbers if you want to. One sort of non-scientific finding here is that companies that have large numbers of consumers as customers generally have a higher volume of law enforcement requests. So, and that's because it's sort of bread and butter crime, right? You're talking about crime like murder, rape, theft, and so on, right? And so it looks like from the data, I'm making some assumptions here, but it looks like there's lots of data in, for instance, Facebook and Facebook-related services. There's lots of data inside of, I'm assuming, Google search results. And this is why these companies are getting these requests. If you look at the companies that I worked at, the requests are, the number of requests are quaint by comparison. Like AWS, almost 100% of their customers are enterprise customers. They're either private sector, public sector customers, they're enterprises. So having an enterprise investigated for crime would be rare compared to consumers. So you see a much, much, much lower volume in those cases. Microsoft is sort of in between, right? They have a big consumer business, but they're an enterprise vendor. So they do have kind of sit both sides here where there could be data related to consumer crime versus enterprise. Now, as a CISO, I'm not really that concerned about consumer crime. It's not part of my job. I am concerned about enterprises and how many requests get submitted for enterprises. Now, in this case, when you take a look at these volumes, they look big, like, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of requests a year. These are global requests. So what you do to try to figure out what the probability that this might impact you is you take the number of users of that service and you divide that, by the number of requests, or the number of requests divided by the number of customers, right? Most of these services have millions, if not tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of customers. So it's very easy to drive, using the customer base, drives the probability that this will impact you as a consumer, or an enterprise for that matter, really, really low. So the probability is like 0.0001% or something like this, right? It's very, very low. So I thought I would show you this data. And this is part of the reason why people are questioning whether the United States has weaponized these capabilities. And if you look at the volume here, the volume from the United States is much, much higher than a country like Canada. Now, the United States has a much, much larger population. But then if you compare it to a country like India that has, 3, 4, 5 times the size of the United States in terms of population, they still don't have the kinds of, as high a volume in some of these areas as the United States, right? In fact, the U.S. has more requests than all the countries you see here combined. So what's going on here? Is it just that law enforcement, uses this as a tool more than in these other countries? Is it that there's more crime in the United States? So there's a bunch of study that has to be done here to really understand what's going on. But when you look at the volume and the scope and the scale of how they're doing these requests, this is where the questions start to come in. In addition to law enforcement, here's the FISA court, right? The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is an act here in the United States that allows law enforcement who are investigating super serious crime like terrorism, anti-money laundering, and so on, to use a secret court instead of going into open court to request warrants and subpoenas and legal orders. And they do that because they're fighting terrorism. The terrorists, they don't want the terrorists to know that they're being investigated. So they use the FISA court as a sort of a secret court to go in there. They still have to meet the burden of proof. They still have to have, probable cause in the United States, kind of the highest bar in the world in terms of probable cause. And you still have to get a judge to agree to a warrant or a subpoena. So what they're showing you here is the authorities in the United States won't allow these companies to publish the specific number of FISA orders that they've been given in any period of time. They're only allowed to publish ranges. So you can see the ranges here. Recently, in the last year and a half, they've started publishing the number of accounts that are impacted in these requests, because you could make one request for access to 100,000 accounts, right? So what I'm showing you here, again, they won't let you, see the specific number, but they'll allow you to publish ranges. And so these companies are now publishing ranges, 157,000 to 157,500, 24,000 to 24,500. And this is where the concern comes in, is you really don't know what's going on here. They're giving these companies these requests from a secret court, so there's no, you have to rely on the FISA program to provide oversight into these requests and make sure they're not just rubber stamping these requests, but they're impacting a lot of accounts here, right? So they're one request can oftentimes, as you can see from the data, if you go into it, is requesting access to multiple accounts. So it's hard to see what's really happening here, but this is another level of concern. FISA was actually going to expire, and it was just actually renewed for another 2 years. So if you hear something like Section 702, that's really what they're talking about. Is FISA, in the FISA Act, there's a section that talks about foreign surveillance and being able to surveil foreigners like outside of the United States, because you're not supposed to surveil U.S. citizens. Problem there is if you're surveilling communication, it's usually between a U.S. citizen and someone else. So by virtue of that, you are surveilling U.S. citizens because they're on one side of that communication. So there's concern there. There's concern with the volume and so on. And so it's interesting to see this data evolve over time. I've been studying this stuff for quite some time. Now, As a CISO, I mentioned I'm interested in enterprises. So I'm really interested in how many of these requests are happening for enterprises versus consumers. And that gives me, as a CISO, the information I need to know whether this threat is something that I need to be concerned about. Do I need to understand the probability and impact of this specific threat to my company? And this is why all these customers at Microsoft and Amazon have been talking to them about these things for years and years and years now. So the answer for AWS was always easy, because everyone in Germany and Brussels and so on, they were all interested in like how many requests from the United States government for data kept outside of the United States has there been? And the answer there in every single one of their reports has been none. So that means the United States is not requesting access to data that's being kept outside the United States in AWS regions in Germany, Brussels, France, and so on. That's what they're really asking about. Same thing with Microsoft. Microsoft has a larger volume of these things. So you can see 28 cases, requests required some disclosure of customer content. Of those 28 instances, 22 were associated with US law enforcement. So this is where the Western European concern comes in. It's like 22 requests from US law enforcement for enterprise data. That's what kind of gets them concerned, right? But again, if you do the math and you say, okay, there's tens of millions of enterprises using these services, the chances of you getting hit, especially if you're not related to terrorism, money laundering, serious crime, is super low compared to other types of threats that you have to deal with. So when you do the math, again, probability is a fraction of 1%. Google, higher numbers here. So you can see that they're getting higher request disclosure for enterprise cloud customer information. So they're in the hundreds here. And then you can take a look at the percent where some requests produce data, right? So there's metadata, which is just, hey, what's the name on the account? What's the phone number? What's the address? What IP address did they use when they created the account and so on? And then there's, hey, I want to see the contents of the email. I want to see the contents of this picture, this document. And so when they say percent of requests where some data is produced, that's what they're talking about here. And so 361 requests, in the 6 months between January 2023 and June, not super high, but for enterprises also not super low. And then almost 60% of them, there was data disclosed, right? So this is where CISOs start to get concerned because they see a higher volume of requests for enterprise data, and then they're actually asking for and getting access to content. So that's where the concern comes in. The metadata is sort of public anyway. Imagine the outside of an envelope when you mail a letter. It's the same thing as the outside of an email when you mail it. There's things that have to be exposed to the public internet for it to be delivered. That's metadata. Okay, so again, numbers super low even for Google, even though they have higher volumes and then they have a higher percent of requests that were actual content got disclosed. Super low numbers relative to their install base of tens of millions of enterprises. So let's get into what I mentioned was the most, I think, interesting part of this. What I learned living in Europe for 3 years during the time when GDPR enforcement started, the Cloud Act was passed, and I was thrown into the lion's den. I was in Berlin weekly, Paris weekly. This is a picture of Stockholm from my hotel. I was there so much. The customs people knew me by name when I'd go through the airport there. I spent a lot of time in these countries and a lot of time listening to customers and what their concern is, right? So the backdrop to all this is huge fines for these high-tech companies, US-based high-tech companies, huge fines. So I'm showing you here the last time I looked this stuff up in the first half of this year, Meta, again, was hit with a $1.2 billion fine related to GDPR. And you can see the list goes on. These are the highest fines. There's sites out there that track the GDPR administrative fines now. Most of them are super small. It seems like the really big ones are all US-based companies, high-tech companies. And so what is the tension here? I'm really interested in this topic because these companies seem to be the ones getting fined. The European companies don't get fines anywhere near this high. They're not any better at complying with GDPR than the American companies, okay, generally speaking, right? And I advised many of them on GDPR while I lived there. So what's really happening here? Is it that these high-tech companies are tone deaf? Like, don't they understand the European perspective? And they all have Europeans working at them. So it's not like they're just all Americans and they're not listening and they don't understand the European perspective. They are Europeans, right? All these companies have tens of thousands of people working in them in Europe. So what is the issue? What's going on here? What's the tension? So after, working in these countries for a long time and really getting to know some of the people, particularly in Germany and Brussels, Finland, I really sort of finally got to kind of peel the onion a bit with them over beers, lots and lots of beers, right? And it's interesting. I think that you can trace this tension back to this picture. Now, I'm doing this to be a little dramatic, of course, but this picture is a picture of the federal German census that was done, as you can see, in 1933. So this is shortly after Hitler came to power. And if you could read German, you would notice that this census card is set up to identify families of Jewish origin. So we all know that this is what happened at this period of time in Germany that led to the Holocaust, okay? And absolutely horrific. It started with this card. Now, this card was new tech. This was high tech of the day. And this census was actually done on behalf of the German federal government by a US-based company. And this card and the machine that processes it was so efficient that they actually used it in the death camps to process incoming prisoners in many of the death camps. And so I'm going to show you the next slide that shows you the machine that processes these cards, and it has the name of the company stamped on the front of it. These people have seen this movie before. They have seen high-tech companies come into their markets and be very helpful with their new technology, okay? And they've learned, clearly what happened in the 1930s and 40s in Germany was horrific. Now, going past World War II, we all know that Germany was divided, East and West Germany, and that the Soviet Union managed East Germany for many, many years, 40 years. When they started to manage East Germany and the wall came up, you'll probably remember, they had this group, the secret police called the Stasi. The Stasi had files on most citizens in Eastern Germany. In fact, according to the Stasi Museum, you could take those files and stack them up and they would be 69 miles long worth of files. And so they had surveillance and files on all the citizens. And I can tell you that 69 miles of files is quaint compared to the cloud. Okay, compared to what the cloud is, and we're all tired of hearing about AI and ML and all this stuff. But this is quaint compared to what we see today, where in this room, I'm probably surrounded by at least 4 cameras and 6 microphones. And I brought them into my house myself. Okay. So these Europeans that I've been talking to about this stuff, they've seen this before. Okay. They know what the unintended consequences are. They've seen it firsthand, and they're not willing to let this happen the way it happened in the past, where we just rush to adopt new technologies and we deal with the unintended consequences later. They're trying to get out in front of this and say, not this time. We're going to deal with this in a way that preserves our privacy, because what you see on the screen right now is what happens when you don't preserve privacy. Okay. Now, it so happens, another thing, when I worked at Microsoft that happened, I mentioned, Edward Snowden in 2013. This was tough. I immediately was working, 12-hour days briefing customers on how, Microsoft doesn't participate in these programs, and all that's true. The other thing that happened is WikiLeaks published a series of communiques one of them called Espionage Lycée, and one of them called Euro Intercepts, in which they released information from, the data that Snowden released, and then I guess they had other information that first alleged that the NSA was monitoring the communications of different French presidents over a 5-year period. They had a policy, at least 10 years, going back 10 years, of economic espionage against France, which, the U.S. government has a stated policy. They don't do economic espionage. They also had these allegations that the NSA were monitoring the phone calls of the German chancellor going back a decade before she was even in office. And then, of course, a bunch of German officials. And that was confirmed by the White House when President Obama came out and apologized to them for that. So there is some truth to what, these different organizations have alleged. So this here really, really, I can't tell you how many Europeans I talked to, specifically in Germany, Brussels, Stockholm, and other places. This has heightened their awareness of what is going on in terms of government access to data and signals intelligence, the James Bond scenario we talked about, and then they're very, very sensitive to even lawful requests for data. And so this isn't a kind of a one-size-fits-all thing. This conversation has been going on for quite some time, and it's evolved over time. So it started off as data residency. Hey, you must build your data centers here. We need the ability to knock down the door with a court order and go in and seize computer equipment when we want it. And that doesn't work anymore because a modern data center is like a Borg cube, right? It's massive. You break down the door, the data is sharded across thousands of systems. Like you can't physically seize it. You need logical access. So data residency as a security control, it's just not. Data residency is security theater. And I've dealt with quite a few customers in Canada and the United States and Western Europe that still cling to this notion of data residency, and we have to keep the data here. There's data sovereignty, which is really the idea that, hey, the laws and the governance structures of the nation where you're collecting the data should apply to the data wherever it is. And then finally, digital sovereignty, which is really about, hey, we own our own digital destiny. Data is more valuable than oil. We have to have the ability to control the entire supply chain. And you've seen increasing regulation with the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the AI Act, and so on, and these increasing fines for big tech. And this will continue to evolve. This is evolving very quickly, and it's really impressive to see the amount of thought that goes into this and how quickly it's actually evolving. All right, go ahead.
Could you please try to finish in 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes.
Give participants to ask questions?
In fact, yes. The answer to all this, though, if you are worried about government access to data, is encryption and key management. You can encrypt data in the cloud. You can keep those keys in your own on-premise environment. And that way, if the key never leaves Canada, and this is critical, right? If you encrypt data using modern encryption, like strong encryption, that it's no longer your data, right? It actually looks more like noise than it looks like your data. So when you move that noise, okay, to another country and put it in a data center, like a hyperscale cloud service provider in another country, okay, that noise is no longer your data. You didn't move your data. Your data never moved unless you moved it, right? You just moved the encrypted form of your data that looks like noise. If the keys to decrypt that data never leave your country, the data never leaves your country. Now, the number of people that struggle with this concept is amazing, right? And so that's where these data residency regulations come into play. And most of the time, they're not even regulations. They're internal security standards that were developed many, many years ago. Anyway, we could talk about this topic all day, but I do want to give you time for questions. Thanks for being so patient.
Thank you so much, Tim, for this great talk. I will open the mics right now. Okay, time for questions. Yes, please, Patrick, go ahead.
Great presentation. Team there, when you say that you cannot, if the data still stays in the country and it doesn't go over, but if you decrypt the noise, isn't that your original data?
Yeah, and in order to decrypt it, though, you need the key.
Oh,
So if that key never leaves your country, the data never left your country. So this is the rub, right? Is when you run into somebody in a government in some country that's stating that data residency is a requirement. It's like, I'm not sure how that's inconsistent with cloud computing and using a hyperscale cloud provider. The other rub to this actually is kind of fun. And I used to do this in Germany a lot. It's like, hey, look, if you go ahead and put your data in the United States, you have the U.S. Constitution protecting it. Because if someone tries to break in, like from the government, and try to steal your data and they get caught, they'll get prosecuted, they'll go to prison. But if you store your data in Germany and those people come over from the United States and steal it, yeah, there's no consequence. The U.S. Constitution doesn't extend to that country, does it? So if you're really worried about this, the place to keep your data is inside the United States, where the rule of law is enforced, right? Anyway, it's funnier when you have beers and you're talking about this over here. Yeah.
Thank you.
NG, please go ahead.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. My question is here it's related to the fact that data, the noise is moved to a different country, but your encryption key stays with you. How does that work in the era of quantum computing? If you're using an encryption that is not quantum safe?
Yeah, so that's the issue, right? Is Microsoft and IBM and Google and many other companies have been trying to come up with quantum safe algorithms and kind of get them through the peer reviews and all the government reviews they have to get through as quickly as possible, because we're not sure when these quantum computers will exist, right? And it's not helpful that these companies keep coming out and saying we have a quantum computer and it's doing all this stuff, because they have, in most cases, they have simulators, right? They don't actually have a quantum computer that's capable of doing the kinds of decryption that we're talking about. And so it kind of muddies the water. You don't know, do these things exist already or don't they, right? Okay. And so for this application, like decrypting data that's been encrypted using strong encryption algorithms, today, as far as I can tell, there's no quantum computers that do that. There's a few post-quantum or quantum safe algorithms that have been going through peer reviews and so on in the industry. I guess we'll see what happens with those. But the key is really to get these quantum safe algorithms into production now as quickly as possible, so that if there is someone collecting data that they can't crack today, if we do have a quantum computer in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever that is, and it's capable of doing this kind of decryption, you want to make sure that it's encrypted with one of those quantum safe algorithms if you could do it, right? So that's why there's been such a race, right? But you can only do what you can do, what's commercially possible in most cases, right? And so, for instance, with us, we've been looking at different places where I've been working. We've been looking at post-quantum stuff for quite some time, and trying to figure out, like, how do we, like, one of the issues is what's called crypto agility, which, even if I did have a quantum safe algorithm, how would I get that into the products that I use? Do the products support me pulling out the RSA algorithms that we've all been using for 30 years and put in another suite of encryption algorithms? In the case, most often is no, it's not. Like, there's not very many products that support that, right? So you need new products, essentially, right? If you're an enterprise procuring products, right? So it's complicated, and it's definitely a race against time. There's no doubt about it. It's probably too late already. If, the Chinese always get, it's always alleged that the Chinese are stealing massive amounts of data. Assuming some of this data is encrypted and somehow they're going to decrypt it in the future, some data has value no matter how old it gets, right? Yeah. Your personal information is an example of that, right? But unfortunately, it's probably been shared illicitly lots already, right? So it's not really a secret anymore. Anyway, I think it's a great question, and I think it's super hard to answer, because we really don't know what the state of quantum is in some of these countries that we're most worried about.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again, Tim, for this great InfoSec seminar. Thank you everyone for participating today, and please be sure to provide us with your name and email address in the linked form so we may send your certificate of attendance. We hope to see you all in our next Infosec seminar in September 2024. Have a great summer break. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thanks, team. Thanks, professors. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.